vanishing folklore and beliefs.
Stories of Old Rome and Greece by Emilie Baker, circa 1913, public domain reading. Venus, Aphrodite. Chapter 11. Venus. Once the stately Juno looked down from the high-peaked Olympus and saw Jupiter walking in a meadow with a maiden so exquisitely fair that the flowers at her feet looked dull and faded beside her dazzling whiteness. This was Callisto, so famous for her beauty that suitors came from distant lands to woo her. But she cared nothing for their rich gifts, nor would she listen to any of their vows of love. Then Jupiter sought her as she wandered alone in the meadow, and the maiden gladly yielded to the great ruler of the gods the love that no mortal man had been able to win. When white-armed Juno learned how many hours Jupiter spent by the side of Callisto, she determined to punish the helpless maiden, and accordingly turned her into a bear. For a long time Jupiter sought her in the familiar meadow, but she never came again to meet him. Then one day he found her in the forest with her little son Arcas, both of them turned into bears by the jealous hate of Juno. Grieved as he was at this misfortune, the ruler of Olympus could not restore them to their human form, but he took them to the heavens that they might suffer no further harm, and placed them in the sky as the constellations of the Great and Little Bear. Jupiter often assumed the form of a bird or animal so as to escape Juno's watchful eyes. As a swan, he won the love of Leda, and their child was the fair-haired Helen, whose beauty cost the men of Troy so dear. As a white bull, he wooed the gentle maid Europa, who was frightened at his sudden appearance in the meadow where she was playing. But as soon as she saw how tame the beautiful animal was, and how anxious to be petted, she lost all her fear. She made a wreath of flowers to hang about his neck, and grew so accustomed to her new playmate that she got upon his back as he bent his lordly head to receive her garlands. The bull then galloped away toward the sea, and before the terrified girl could realize what had happened, he plunged with her into the waves. As soon as they were far from the land, the white bull spoke gently to Europa, and told her who he really was, and how, for love of her, he had assumed this strange disguise. So the maiden was no longer afraid, but allowed herself to be carried to an unknown land that was afterwards called Europe in her honor. It was no wonder that Juno kept watch over the earth, as no other goddess needed to do, for she knew that the loveliness that belonged to the daughters of men could easily lure great Jupiter from his golden throne. She was therefore very reasonably angry when one day she looked through the white clouds around Olympus and saw, not on the earth, but in the lap of the ever-tossing sea, the most beautiful being that could ever exist outside of a dream. So wonderfully fair was this maiden, upon whom Juno fixed her restful gaze, that she seemed too perfect to be made of flesh and blood, and the jealous watcher was almost persuaded that it was no real living thing which rested softly on the crest of the waves, but some creature made from the rainbow colors and white mist of the sea. The ocean rocked her lightly on its breast, and Zephyrus, the wind of the west, bore her gently towards the shore. The sunlight shone on her rosy flesh, and her long hair lay upon the waves, glistening like spun gold. The sky above her was not more soft or deep than the blueness of her eyes, and the smile upon her perfect lips was of a subtle sweetness, more alluring than the breath of spring. As she lay pillowed in the arms of the slow swinging sea, the west wind bore her to the island of Cyprus, and when her foot touched the warm sand, the goddess rose from the waves, which were so loth to yield her to the waiting earth, and stepped lightly upon the shore. She flung the wet ringlets from her forehead, shook the foam from her breast and shoulders, white as the purest marble, and stood upright in the warm sunshine, the most perfect thing that the wondering old earth had ever looked upon. And this was Venus, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, born of the foam of the sea, and destined to be the most far-famed of all the dwellers in Olympus. It was not long before others than the watchful Juno had seen this vision. It was not long before others than the watchful Juno had seen this vision of loveliness, and she was eagerly welcomed by the gods as soon as she appeared among them. The beauty and grace of the new goddess so charmed them all that all were eager to yield her homage, and she was immediately sought in marriage. Even Jupiter himself became an enamored suitor. But laughter-loving Venus refused to be wed, and would not listen to any wooing. Then the ruler of the gods, finding his proffered love scorned by the proud goddess, determined to punish her by compelling her to marry Vulcan, the ugliest and most ill-favored of deities. And as Jupiter's word was law in all the universe, Venus was obliged to obey. But though married, she was by no means a devoted or faithful wife, and she caused poor Vulcan many unhappy moments, for he saw how his misshapen form repelled her, and he knew that she would seek for happiness elsewhere. The first to win the love of golden Venus was Mars, Ares, the handsome god of war, though delighted at being honored as the chosen one of beauty, was careful that the goddess's preference should not be known. When he and Venus met in some lover's bower, they placed Electryon, the attendant of Mars, on guard, so that no one, not even the prying Juno, would come upon them unawares. Things went on happily for some time, but one day Electryon fell asleep at his post, and slept so soundly that he did not see Apollo in his golden chariot, driving close to the trysting place of the lovers. When the sun god realized what was happening, he went straightway to Vulcan and told him how much his wife was enjoying the society of Mars. Vulcan, angry and ashamed, set to work to forge a net of linked steel, and when it was finished, he hurried with it to the spot where Venus and Mars were still conversing together. Stepping up softly behind them, Vulcan drew the net over their heads, and thus held them fast. Then he hastened back to Olympus, where he told his story and bade all the gods go look upon the ridiculous and humiliating plight of the imprisoned lovers. When the captured pair were at last set free, Mars rushed off to find Electron and to learn why they had not been warned of Apollo's approach. Finding his sentinel peacefully sleeping, unmindful of the disaster that had occurred through his neglect of duty, Mars was so enraged that he changed Electron into a cock and commanded the rooster to rise early every morning and crow to announce the coming of the sun, i.e. Apollo. The next fancy of Venus was for Adonis, a handsome young hunter who was so fearless in his pursuit of game that the goddess often felt anxious for his safety. She urged him to give up the chase and spend all his day with her. But however much Adonis enjoyed the society of Venus, he also loved to roam the forests, and no entreaties could induce him to give up his favorite sport. One day Adonis was following a wild boar, and believing that the creature was wounded, he boldly drew near. When the boar turned suddenly upon him and drove his long tusks into the youth's side. As he lay dying in the forest, Venus heard of the tragic ending of the day's hunt and hurried to save him. So careless was she of her own hurt that she rushed heedlessly through the rough briars, which tore her soft skin and scattered drops of her blood on the white wood flowers. When she reached Adonis, he was already past her help and could not respond to her caress. Holding his lifeless body in her arms, Venus wept and mourned for her beloved, and her tears, as they fell upon the sympathizing earth, were changed into anemones. Then, to hide from her eyes the painful sight of the young hunter's mangled body, the kindly earth again took pity on her grief, and turned the drops of blood that came from Adonis's side into red roses. Still the goddess would not be comforted, but sat mourning alone with her dead. Then Mercury came to lead the soul of Adonis to gloomy Hades, and when the messenger of the gods had departed with his slight burden, Venus went back to Olympus, and throwing herself on the ground before Jupiter's throne, she besought him to give Adonis back to her, or else to allow her to stay with him in Hades. Since the world could not well spare the goddess of beauty, Jupiter refused to let her go to the sunless realm of Pluto. But neither would that dread ruler consent to give up Adonis to her longing arms. Then the gods, touched by the depth of Venus's grief, interceded in her behalf, and reluctantly Pluto agreed to allow Adonis to spend 6 months with the goddess in the warmth and joy of the sunlight, if for the rest of the year he would be content to dwell in Hades. Another of the fortunate ones who gained the love of Venus was Anchises, the prince of Troy. But though the goddess lavished much affection upon him, she was rather ashamed of her attachment, for Anchises was of only mortal birth. She therefore bade him to keep the matter secret, and for a time Anchises obeyed. But being proud of his relation to the goddess, he forgot her instructions and boasted of his good fortune. This so angered the willful Venus that she never bestowed her favors on him again, but transferred all her affections to her son, Aeneas, who fared better at her hands than his father, Anchises. In the many adventures that befell this famous hero, Venus was always a ready protectress, and whenever Aeneas was involved in some apparently hopeless situation, his goddess mother would immediately hide him in a thick mist, which was sure to baffle his enemies. Sometimes, as in the Trojan War, she wrapped him in her shining robe and bore him from the battlefield. And if the hero was constantly in tears, as the poet Virgil says, it was certainly not the fault of Venus. As to the ultimate fate of Anchises, some authorities say that the offended goddess borrowed one of Jupiter's thunderbolts and disposed of her talkative lover in this fashion. But the most probable story is that he lived to see Aeneas become a famous prince of Troy, and was he himself carried from the ruins of that burning city on the shoulders of his devoted son.